Welcome to Unpacking Armenian Studies for a New Era. When we began recording Unpacking Armenian Studies podcasts about 4 years ago, the purpose was to understand what scholars are studying and why. With the 2020 war over Karabakh, with Armenians on one side and Azerbaijan and Turkey on the other, the nature of the conversation changed, and we recorded 2 extensive series, one called Armenia and Azerbaijan at War, the other called After War, Before Peace, which explored the many still unresolved issues of the conflict, issues that must be addressed wisely and justly with the long view in mind, if there is to be the beginning of a hope for peace. Today, we're back with a limited series we're calling Ukraine, Armenia, and War. There's that word again. The purpose is to understand this new war, the war that is, at this moment at least, in the second week of March 2022, between Russia and Ukraine, a war that began with Russia's invasion of a sovereign country. But we're going to try to understand this war from a very specific perspective, from the perspective of Armenia and Armenians, and all of the Caucasus, really, where political and economic prospects are deeply entwined with the various parties in and around this war. On the one hand, the 2 parties involved in 2020 were rather insignificant in size, economy, or on the international stage. On the other hand, Russia and Ukraine are the exact opposite. Still, with so much that is happening now in 2022 being reminiscent of what happened in 2020, and so much that was possibly triggered by the 2020 war, as some commentators have actually said, and still now with so much that is to come and that will impact all the countries, large and small, we have a lot to unpack. So let's get going and speak to today's guest. Professor Ronald Suny is a historian and political scientist. He is the William H. Sewell Jr. Distinguished University Professor of History at the University of Michigan and is Emeritus Professor of Political Science and History at the University of Chicago. His fields of study, here they go: Soviet Union, the post-Soviet space, particularly Russia, nationalism, ethnic conflict, the role of emotions in politics, the South Caucasus, and Russian-Soviet historiography. And he is among the deans of Armenian studies and has written extensively about the genocide, about Karabakh, and about Armenia's own rather uneven state-building process. So with that really brief introduction of Professor Ronald Suny, Ron, welcome.
Welcome, Salpi. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you, even though we are doing this again about war that seems, like Jell-O. It's so many levels and layers to try to get our heads around. But with you, Ron, I really would like to talk about sovereignty, about the definitions and assumptions about sovereignty that have either suddenly, or maybe you'll say not so suddenly, changed. We can start with the general, or really just get down to Putin dismissing Ukrainian sovereignty.
Yeah, the first thing to say is that this term sovereignty has a long history, okay? It sort of comes into the political vocabulary in Europe in the 16th century. So we're moving from the medieval age to the early modern age. We're moving from a period of feudal kingdoms and principalities with overlapping sovereignties. The local lord is the vassal of the prince, who's the vassal of the king, and so forth, into what we might call the beginnings, at least in Europe again, of the modern state. And the modern state develops this concept of sovereignty, which is based on now a territorial entity. So we'll call it a territorial state. And within that state, there is some absolute authority, the sovereign. Eventually, this will be like an absolute monarch, or in modern times, it will be the people. The people are sovereign in democracies. But this concept of sovereignty has several other independent meanings as well. First of all, sovereign states means that they're inviolable from interference from other states. So we don't have divine authority as we had in the Middle Ages, which interfered with local authorities. We've got particularized secular authorities in territorialized states, right?
And that's the assumption, right? That they are
the assumption.
inviolable.
Right now, we're talking about theory. We're going to get to actual realities. The concept of sovereignty then requires, very important for us in discussion about Armenia, requires recognition by and non-interference from other states, right? Now, that means the sovereign state recognizes others, the other states, in order to protect their sovereignty, recognizes others as well. And the state has a very important function as a sovereign state to regulate what passes across its borders. It has to be able to control its borders so that it control what happens within the borders. Now, all of this depends on general international agreement. So there's an accepted custom that you recognize the sovereignty of others, which then legitimizes and protects your sovereignty. But I'm going to add one thing. I love the title of a Stanford political scientist, Stephen Krasner's book on this subject. And he called the book Sovereignty, Organized Hypocrisy.
Okay, we can end the podcast right there. You've just put it all together. Organized hypocrisy, indeed.
So here's the problem, is that in this sovereign world of independent sovereign states, each state is supposed to be treated, no matter what its size or power, as equal to others, right? So it's like citizens in a democracy. They're, of course, some are tall, some are small, some are smart, some are lucky to be Armenian, some are not, but still they're equal in some way, right?
Yeah, but not just equal. What you said earlier, the key word about recognizing, huh?
Yes.
Recognizing assumes you are now endowing this other entity with with safety, with sovereignty, with inviolability.
That's right. That's right. And everyone has to be treated equally as citizens would be in a republic or a democracy. So in the international arena, this anarchic constellation of independent sovereign states, they're supposed to be equal. But where does the hypocrisy comes in? Because from the very beginning, the principle of hypocrisy was violated by a few states, we'll call them the great powers, which always try to exercise some kind of hegemonic, dominant power over weaker states.
And what states are we talking about, and where are these examples of already violating it?
So historically, they could have been Great Britain, they could have been Russia, they could have been many states. Let's think about it today. There are a few great powers in the world, and there's one super duper hyperpower, and that's the United States. So the United States, in some ways, makes the rules of the game. Some it accepts that others accept, some it just violates. And it has, because it's so powerful and because it's an example to others, when it violates the sovereignty of other states, invading twice Iraq, Afghanistan, and so forth, and how many dozens of times in Latin America, then it sort of cripples and limits the absolute influence of this concept, this hypocritical concept of sovereignty.
Which cuts two ways, Ron. On the one hand, by invading Iraq and possibly Syria, depending on how we want to define invade.
Oh, absolutely.
By recognizing the status of Kosovo. So on the one hand, we're talking about all of the precedents that Russia can therefore look at and say, hey, we all do this. But the flip side of that is the Ukrainians look at US interference in Yugoslavia, for example, and say, well, you can do this, so why aren't you doing it? And so it cuts both ways, this playing with the rules.
Yeah, both Yeltsin and Putin warned the world that when they decided that Kosovo could be independent of Serbia, which was a legitimate part, they were throwing the cards up in the air. They were creating a new world, and almost immediately, Putin then, when in 2008, declared the independence of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And the interesting thing is, so Armenia, given the wars in Karabakh after 1994 and the armistice, occupied a large part of what internationally was recognized as the sovereign territory of Azerbaijan, right?
Right.
And in that whole period, from 1994 up until the fall of 2020, Armenia was in some sense seriously in violation of international law, hoping, perhaps futilely, that some of the ways in which the game had been played hypocritically might also apply to it. But that didn't work out. And when Turkey, with its drones, and Azerbaijan launched the war against Armenia in the fall of 2020, Russia, ironically, recognized sovereignty and stood by and watched as those Bayraktar drones beat up and destroyed Armenian units, and only came into the play later as a mediator to stand between the forces of Armenia and Azerbaijan.
And often the response to that is, by many Armenians, is that therefore we people of the world should call for the recognition of Karabakh, as if that would somehow preclude a repetition of that sort of left to its own devices situation.
You can be sure that's not going to happen.
The recognition or the resultant inviolability.
What I mean is Karabakh is in a very precarious state. It's guarded by, it's legally by international law part of Azerbaijan, but it still houses Armenians and has some degree of self-rule very precariously, and because there are Russian troops there as well. So it's a kind of netherworld. It's a kind of in-between world right now, and we have to see how that's going to work out. But the international community and even Russia does not seem to be ready to do what Russia did with Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and more recently with these two phony people's republics of Donetsk and Luhansk inside Ukraine. So this is there are examples used. Different great powers are appealing to different examples, but Armenians are incidental to these powers in general. Look at the response, and Armenians are upset by this, and very, very importantly, to the war in Armenia, which was sort of on the back burner and on the back pages in the international press, and the war in Ukraine. Now, for good reasons. It's a big state. It's in this, as they say, the center of Europe. Notice the implied racism in this, by the way, that wars in the Caucasus or with those strange peoples we don't remember, or in Iraq or in the Third World or Africa, Yemen, Ethiopia, are less important somehow to the public sphere in the United States and in Europe than a war of these, white folks in Ukraine.
But once you get over those hurt feelings, and I don't mean to minimize them, but the reality that Russia has invaded Ukraine, not a small out of the way country. And again, the world can watch and can commiserate and can condemn and can do nothing about the inviolability of those borders. And you said something interesting a little while ago. You said part of the definition of sovereignty is that someone can control what passes through those borders. Well, information passes through those borders. And so it makes this inviolability hypocrisy even worse?
You know, we're actually, because of the rise of global capitalism and the rise of the internet and international communications and the internationalization of labor flows and refugees and so forth, we in some ways are moving toward a post-sovereign age, right? Globalization doesn't recognize borders. Capitals flows and labor, if you need it, move around, and they create their own kinds of problems. But the sovereign state, which, as I said, begins in Europe in the 16th century, still remains as a kind of concept, but it's one which is being threatened all the time. Now, in the case of Ukraine, Ukraine is a sovereign state. By the way, a sovereign state that repeatedly Russia recognized, made agreements with, the removal of nuclear weapons, for instance, in the Bucharest Agreement. All of those things were all made at certain times, and Russia recognized them. So what Putin has done is very much what Aliyev did. Of course, Aliyev was doing it in what he conceived as his own state. Putin knows whatever one people, Yedini Narod, that he calls Ukrainians and Russians, he knows he crossed the border. And he knows there would have been consequences because he invaded another state, a member of the United Nations, recognized internationally as another state. And yet he did it. And he is going to pay, and Russia's paying sadly. And of course, Ukraine is paying very brutally and making great sacrifices for this unprovoked, unnecessary invasion of a sovereign state.
Can I ask you an impossible question?
Always.
If we look at this quagmire that is raising so many questions for the world, but if we look at it from Armenia or from the Caucasus generally, which is going to be harder going forward, if Russia wins or if Russia loses? And what does win or lose, what does lose particularly mean in this context?
What a good question. And of course, I can't predict the future, but Russia will win the war, that is militarily. Putin can't stop. He can't be totally humiliated. That would humiliate him on the world stage, even though now he's created a pariah state of Russia, and it may weaken him very seriously domestically. We may be seeing, by the way, the beginning of the end of Putin through this war, which I think is going to be a loss in another sense. It's going to make Russia weaker. Putin is getting everything he didn't want, which is a hostile Ukraine, a country of 42 or more million people, the increased unity and even expansion of NATO, another thing he didn't want, isolation from the international capitalist system, right? With all these sanctions. So Russia's going to be weaker economically, weaker in terms of allies, though it did find a new ally, a rather reluctant one in China. And also it's going to be a state that is going to be disconnected from the markets of its own products like oil and gas. So in many ways, Putin has made a blunder, a terrible mistake, in some ways, an international crime, and he's going to pay for it. And sadly, the Russian people, as well as the Ukrainians, are going to suffer for this.
From the Caucasus, what are going to be the long-term implications of whether it's a win or a loss? At the end of the day, it is this completely new sort of status for Russia and new set of capabilities for Russia, diminished capabilities in many ways.
Right. Yeah, you know, Armenia lives in a very hostile neighborhood. It has two states which are inimical to it, that is Azerbaijan and Turkey, and they've made it known now that they will use force to get their will in the Caucasus. Armenia has two possible nearby allies. One is Russia, the other Iran. These are two states which, for a variety of historical reasons, now are considered outside the normal family of nations. So Armenia is in an extraordinarily precarious position, and it's even more dependent on Russia now than it ever was. But Russia is an independent sovereign state with its own interests that may, in fact, and often do, conflict with the interests of Armenia, right? So that puts us, again, in a very precarious position. This is not the Soviet Union, where Armenia was part of a huge pseudo-federation that was dominated by Russians and that built the city of Yerevan and gave us an opera house and made a subway and all the rest of it. That's gone. Now Russia will think first of its own interests, and if Armenians' interests conform to those, fine. If not, Russia first.
I'm going to try to ask you three questions before our time is up. One of them has to do with, well, with sovereignty, of course, but looked at in a different way. If this new interim world order, whatever it is we're in right now, has decided that sanctions are acceptable, I mean, you know, Iran, Syria, Russia, and that they are going to be applied at a certain point in an unacceptable, perceived unacceptable situation. Why can't all of that be done prior to that situation? Why can the West not justify doing this to human rights violators and tyrannical leaders before the catastrophe happens? What stops them from making up that new rule?
Well, sometimes they do that. They try to use it as a deterrent before the event, you know, or they might use them as a warning. If you do this, then you'll be sanctioned in this particular way and you'll suffer. And that, of course, did not work in this case at all. It was clear that there were going to be very serious sanctions, along with the mothballing of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline by Germany. And yet a nation that feels threatened, and apparently, I think Putin unnecessarily, but in his own mind, felt threatened by what the future held if Ukraine was allowed outside some Russian-dominated sphere. And so when you feel your security is threatened, then the economic costs that you may bear are acceptable. Now, what I think is Putin misread the whole situation, that Ukraine was not a serious, immediate threat to Russia. That
NATO was not going to accept it anytime soon.
And everybody said that, and everyone knew that. But he was thinking, you know, in some long range, maybe, or some, delusional fashion. It's hard to know at the moment. And so he acted, I would say, desperately not in his own and in Russia's interest, and certainly not in Ukraine's interest.
It was in that long article that he wrote recently where he appeared to question the sovereignty and the wisdom of giving sovereignty to the 15 constituent republics of the Soviet Union. Where does that fit in all this? Is that something that the other constituent republics should worry about?
Salpi, first of all, you know me well enough. I'm one of those persons. There's one statement of Putin's that I agree with, that the disintegration of the Soviet Union was a disaster. The Soviet Union disintegrated at exactly the moment when it was becoming democratic, when the republics were getting greater autonomy. In other words, one could have imagined in some utopian way that the Soviet Union could have evolved under Gorbachev, who was a real genuine Democrat, into something like the European Union. But that didn't happen for a variety of reasons. It was a coup d'etat. Gorbachev was weak. Yeltsin and the two leaders of Belarus and Ukraine conspired in a kind of drunken stupor to break up the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union committed suicide, as our first president Petrosyan said at the time. Armenia didn't exactly leave the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union left us. So, okay, that's gone. You can't rewrite history. It's over, right? But it seems to me that if there can be some way to think about a future in which people and states would respect one another in the fiction of sovereignty, maybe then small states like Armenia, which have all kinds of things. I'm not being some kind of nationalist, I'm anti-nationalist, but some kind of gift to give to the world. Culture, certain experiences, understandings, a very vibrant public sphere that's fearless and thinks seriously, a highly educated population, and other things like that. Maybe then we can move into something more sensible. That does not seem on the agenda at the moment, not when Russia has launched this terrible war and in some ways shaken up the whole nature of the international system. There's going to be a stronger NATO. There's going to be a new Cold War. The Iron Curtain will have moved further to the east. And those behind it, and in some ways Armenia will be a victim of this, are going to be in a less propitious position with the rest of the world than they have been in the 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union.
If I was wise, I would stop now after all that wisdom, but I'm going to ask this other question anyway. Belarus for Russia and Turkey for Azerbaijan. That is, the process of executing the war, the 44-day war over Karabakh, changed when Turkey joined Azerbaijan overtly. And Belarus's very comfortable partnership with Russia has made Ukraine vulnerable in ways it otherwise might not have been, and Kiev for sure vulnerable in ways it otherwise might not have been. Where does this fit into these formulas? What do you do with these neighbors to whom you could say, stay out of this, let it work itself out?
The international system, all international relations theorists say, is an anarchy. It's an anarchic system. It's a self-serve system. Every state has to look out for themselves. And some great powers, large powers, powerful economic and military powers have a lot of say, and smaller ones like Armenia have to adjust to the realities. And the reality here is that, as I said before, Russia will act in its own interest. Look, recently, they made a treaty with Azerbaijan. They sell weapons to both Azerbaijan and to Armenia. So the Armenians, we hope, can create a kind of intelligent, statesman-like approach to the international situation and can survive into the future. I don't think we're seeing the end of Armenia. I think that in some funny way, having an Armenia there is something Russia treasures. It's its most loyal ally in the Caucasus, and Turkey knows that, and Azerbaijan knows that. And now Russian boots are on the ground nearby, and so and we know how ready to act Putin is. So in some ways, even though Armenia is in some ways so dependent on Russia, Russia also understands that its own prestige, its own position in the Caucasus is dependent on Armenia and on the goodwill and its ability to keep that alliance alive and well. So I can't predict anything. I'm a historian. We tend to look backwards rather than forward. But don't be too pessimistic. Even though the position is vulnerable and the situation is precarious, I have great hope for that little country because mainly its main resource. And what is its main resource? It's not tooth stone, it's the people. And it's the diaspora relations of those people. And so we can at least try to preserve a degree of optimism and hope.
Well, I hope that our listeners will listen to all of the episodes in this series, because so much of what you say has been echoed by very different people and very different perspectives, including about the Ukrainian diaspora. Professor Ronald Suny, thank you very much for your time and your wisdom. It is always a pleasure to speak with you, and I hope the next time we do it, the title does not include the word war.
I'm for that. And thank you, Salbi. This was a great pleasure for me.
Thank you. And thank you to all of you who are following this podcast series. Please share widely. And please know that there is much more on the University of Southern California Institute of Armenian Studies YouTube channel and website. I'm Salpi Lazarian. This is Unpacking Armenian Studies.
You've been listening to Unpacking Armenian Studies. This episode has been produced by Sadin Habesyan. Music by Josue Gonzalez. For more from the USC Institute of Armenian Studies, go to the Institute's YouTube channel to hear dozens of talks by scholars from all over the world. You can reach the Institute at Armenian.usc.edu and follow the Institute on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. This podcast has been recorded at the University of Southern California, Dornsife College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences.